When did you realize your dramatic friend wasn't exaggerating after all? My coworker Jake started showing up to work looking exhausted, with bags under his eyes so dark they looked like bruises, and I finally pulled him aside during break to ask what was wrong. He slumped against the break room wall and told me his neighbors were making his life absolute hell. They'd bang on the walls all night long, stomp around at 3 in the morning, and scream at each other until dawn. I was sitting there eating my granola bar and getting genuinely pissed off for him because nobody deserves to live like that. He pulled out his phone and showed me a recording he'd made, but the audio quality was terrible, and I could barely make out anything beyond some static and muffled sounds. I told him I knew how frustrating that was when you're running on no sleep, and even the evidence won't cooperate, but he should definitely call his landlord about this harassment. The other coworkers would roll their eyes whenever Jake brought up his neighbor situation, whispering that he was being dramatic as usual, but I kept encouraging him to document everything and maybe even get the police involved. Jake seemed so relieved that someone was finally taking him seriously, and he said it felt good to vent to someone who actually listened instead of dismissing him like everyone else did. About a week later, Jake came in looking completely wrecked. His uniform shirt was half untucked, he kept rubbing his eyes like he couldn't keep them open, and when he bent down to pick up a case of water, his hands were trembling so bad he almost dropped it. He pulled me aside near the dairy cooler and told me things had gotten so much worse because now the neighbors were following him around, showing up wherever he went. They'd followed him to his car after work yesterday, and he'd seen them drive past his parents' house when he was visiting. I was getting seriously worried and told him this was stalking and he needed to file a police report immediately. He let out this exhausted laugh and said he'd called the cops 3 times already, but nothing ever happened because these people were smart about it, always leaving before police arrived, never doing anything they could prove. Jake glanced toward the front windows and tensed up, saying he'd seen their car in the parking lot when he came in, that blue Honda parked by the cart return. I looked out and saw the car he meant, though I couldn't see anyone inside from where we were standing. I told him I'd walk out with him after our shift to make sure everything was cool, but then I thought about it more and suggested maybe he should crash at his parents' place for a while until this blew over. He could get some actual sleep there, gather all his documentation, and then go down to the police station in person to file a restraining order or whatever he needed to do. Jake nodded slowly and said that actually made sense, that he'd been thinking about going to his parents anyway but kept putting it off, and he thanked me for pushing him to finally do it. A few days later, our manager mentioned Jake had called in sick, and after a week of absences, word got around that he'd been let go for missing too many shifts, which made me feel sick because I kept thinking my advice had somehow made things worse. After about a month of radio silence, Jake walked back into the store one morning like nothing had happened, though he looked healthier and had clearly been sleeping better. I caught up with him in the stockroom and asked if he'd finally gotten those psycho neighbors evicted or if he'd moved somewhere else to escape them. He gave me this long, uncomfortable look before saying something like, yeah, something like that, in a way that made it clear he didn't want to talk about specifics. He mentioned he'd been in the hospital for a while and had to sort some things out, which made my chest tighten because those assholes had literally harassed him to the point of needing medical help. I told him it was complete bullshit that the store had fired him while he was dealing with all that, but he just shrugged and said he was grateful they'd hired him back at all. Later that afternoon, one of the guys who'd worked at the store longer than me pulled me aside in the break room with this weird expression on his face and asked if I'd heard what actually happened with Jake's neighbors. That's when he told me the truth that made my stomach drop. Jake's apartment was at the very end of his building's hallway, with a brick wall on one side and only one neighboring unit on the other side. The property manager had confirmed that the neighboring apartment had been completely vacant for 8 months before Jake even moved into the building, with no tenants, no furniture, and definitely no one living there to bang on walls or follow him around. All those times Jake called the police and they couldn't do anything. It was because there was literally nothing they could do since no one was there. The harassment, the stalking, the cars following him, and the voices through the walls were all auditory and visual hallucinations that Jake had been experiencing due to undiagnosed schizophrenia. The hospital stay happened because he actually did go to his parents' house that night like I'd suggested, and when they saw him pacing around their living room at 3 in the morning yelling at people who weren't there, they realized something was seriously wrong and got him admitted for psychiatric evaluation. Jake's doing much better now with proper treatment and medication, and he recently mentioned that his new neighbors are super quiet and friendly. I just smile and tell him that's great, really hoping they actually exist this time.